Welcome everyone to our NSC Tech Talk series. I'm David Love. I'm a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Purdue University, and I am also a member of the executive committee of the NSC. Today's Tech Talk is entitled State of the Art in Spectrum Sharing Technologies, Where We Are and What's Next. The discussion today will examine spectrum sharing, the motivation for it, state-of-the-art technologies, and what is needed in the future. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I would like to say a little bit about NSC. We are a 440 plus member organization working with the government and each other to incubate, accelerate, and operationalize revolutionary advances in technology and to inform the policies that make these advances possible. We aim to do this in a collaborative manner. For example, in October, we established a joint industry, academia, and government task group called PATHS to explore spectrum sharing solutions in mid-band spectrum in collaboration with the Department of Defense. Feel free to reach out to me or another executive committee member if you have questions about the NSC or the working groups. With that said, let me turn it over to our moderator, Kelcee Griffis, who is a senior telecom reporter at Law 360.
Thank you so much, David. I'm really happy to be with you all here today. So let me go ahead and introduce our other panelists. We are going to be joined by Mark McHenry, CEO and founder of the Shared Spectrum Company, Derek Peterson, CTO of Boingo Wireless, Sachin Shetty, professor at the Department of Computational Modeling and Simulation Engineering, and associate director at Virginia Modeling, Analysis, and Simulation Center at the Old Dominion University. And finally, we have Joshua Weaver of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. We're going to start off by taking a few minutes for each of our speakers to introduce themselves, talk about the state of shared spectrum, and just give us a little overview of your work. So for those of you who are just tuning in, please feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we will hope to get to those questions at the end of the panel. So with that said, Mark, maybe you can go ahead and kick things off.
Okay, I'm Mark McHenry with Shared Spectrum, and of course I have my slides. I have my crutches ready. So can we display the slides? I'm going to talk about kind of the present situation of spectrum sharing, and the most important, the second slide is really the most important, about what are the shortfalls, why change, why upgrade, and then I'll give you my vision of why the upgrade. So I don't see the slides there. Are they being presented? No. I'd have trouble briefing his slides. I've never seen them. So that's my slides. The next slide, slide one, talks about it was really two forks in the road. Go to the next slide, slide one. That's slide 0. I don't know if people remember, there's a thing called dynamic frequency selection, where they added DFS on your cell phones. There's hundreds of millions of devices with the DFS approach, which is distributed sensing. Go to the next slide. But for a variety of reasons, the centralized database approach won out. So there was a whole series of these database approaches. The TV white space was the start. There we go. And there's a list of them there. And then CBRS. CBRS, I listened to the Wind Forum talk a few days ago, the end of the year talk. They've made tremendous progress. You got to really hand it to those guys. They got a whole, there's an industry now to do spectrum sharing. So they took us from really a niche, which DFS was kind of a niche with a few industry players. So CBRS opened it up to a huge numbers of players and direct involvement. They really made a big step forward. But in the end, they just automated the present approach to do it. The present approach is you collect all the legacy system parameters, you have prop models in a database, you crunch some numbers, you make INR assessments, and you tell people what they can do. It's a mother may I system based on propagation models. And that's being extended in the AFC 6 gigahertz and the incumbent informing. So, I mean, that's really the state of the art. And there's huge benefits of that approach. I mean, I argued against it. I was on the sensing side when this all happened, but it's very easy to understand this approach. It seems really simple and it's easy to implement. So there's a lot of advantages. But when you really look at it, there's been almost no progress. Other than speeding things up and automating, how it's done now in CBRS is exactly how you do it with this manual approach in email. So I don't think there's a lot of technical progress. There's been a lot of political and group hug, but they made progress in there, but not on the approach. The next chart shows, this is the most important chart, is What are the requirements? I mean, if they met all the requirements, we'd be done. This seminar would have no value. But there's a list here, like I think we need to support mobile users and the next generation spectrum sharing. And CBRS does not support mobility, but it is adjustable, but it doesn't work outside CONUS. And we go through each of these. But there's a lot of important requirements that a centralized database approach just won't meet. And probably one of the most important, I think it's very wasteful because it deals with a thing called propagation loss uncertainty, because it's relying on prop models. So I guess if you don't believe what we have is good, it's not good enough, I think you're wrong. I think that you're going to see tremendous improvements with the next generation. There's a lot of requirements that the current ones don't meet. So the next slide talks about, I think, one of the most important requirements, especially on these new spectrum bands, where there's more and more federal incumbents, is you've got to have efficient spectrum sharing. And anything based on a propagation model, if I go outside and measure my prop loss between any 2 points, if I got within 40 dB, that would be lucky. I mean, to get within 20 dB would be unbelievable. And if I did it 1,000 times on the median, I might get 10 or 20 dB accuracy. But on one measurement case, it could easily be 40 dB off and no one would bat an eye. And what that means is there's a huge amount of spectrum that's going to not be shared because there's so much uncertainty. And that's what this little figure shows is as you get closer and closer to the incumbent, shown there is that radio telescope. Eventually you have to be stopped. And with a sensing-based approach, you can get much, much closer than a database. And I don't think people have done a lot of analysis and calculation. They don't want to do those analysis and calculations, but it's a huge impact. So the next chart just shows how sensing works. That if you know the transmit power of your legacy system and you measure the power coming towards you and measure your receive power, you can estimate the prop loss. It's a direct measurement. It's accurate within tenths of a dB. Now you have to know their transmit power, so there's some uncertainty, and they have to use the same antenna that they receive on that they transmit on. Not all systems meet that. But when this rule works, it is so much more efficient. And it's not employed right now. It was employed in DFS, but not in the database approach. So the next chart shows about what's going to happen, I think, is the sensing-based approach doesn't work in certain cases. Go to the next slide. You know, if you had a radio astronomy situation, sensing is useless. In the same ways, if you had a receiver that didn't report its location, a database approach is useless. So what you see is there's some useless cases for each of these rules. And some of these are important use cases. So I think, to me, the big conclusion is the next generation system has to support a combination of rules. The rules have to be tailored depending on, I'm really cost conscious, or I'm going against high security legacy users that don't want to give me their position. So we have to blend these to make this work. And it's going to be orders of magnitude improvement. It'll be new use cases you can address. And so the next chart just shows the vision, how this would work, where the wireless device provides evidence to an onboard thing called a reasoner. And a reasoner has as much of the constraints as you can give the device. I believe you could download the entire AFC 6 GHz database into the devices. There's no reason to have Mother May I database. You could do almost everything on the node for a lot of these sharing schemes. But you also need to have control, and you have to adjust these policies when they go wrong. So I think the vision of the future is run multiple rules, put as much on the edge as possible, but still manage them. So I went over my 5 minutes, so I'm done. Over to the next person.
Awesome, thank you so much, Mark. Derek, let's turn things over to you.
All right, hey everyone, this is Derek Peterson. I'm the CTO for Boingo Wireless. Many people probably know us from our Wi-Fi days, but we've been doing cellular and Wi-Fi for years, both private networks, public networks, on all kinds of frequencies. One of the reasons I'm here is because I'm fortunate enough to sit on the board of the CBRS Alliance, or the OnGo Alliance, and then also on the WBA Alliance, where we're working on the AFC and some of the changes we're trying to do there for Wi-Fi. You know, the key thing I'll just share on my idea of spectrum sharing is inside of a venue, what we want to be able to do is support everybody. You want to support the operators and those public networks that they have, but you also have a lot of private services and operational things that you're trying to do as we start seeing the digital transformation happen. That means we need to use all the spectrum we have available to us, and we can't keep thinking of it as unlicensed and licensed and shared, but really a whole group of technology that's available to us to be able to give everybody 100 megahertz is the goal that I have when I think about a venue. And so that's, how do you do that? Well, spectrum sharing and the idea of spectrum sharing is important. As Mark said, I agree, you know, there's an evolution happening. We've seen the sensing capabilities, and I think that's very important, whether you talk ESC or DFS as our beginning for our evolution in doing better sensing. And then we've seen the database approaches with, you know, the SASs and now this AFC approach. But I think the key thing is combining them both, because you're going to need both solutions depending on the venue and depending on the location. And so there's going to be this combination that's going to happen. And especially as you start bringing in regulations like 911 and all those things, it's real important that you end up having location as part of what you're doing. One of the things that I always like to say is that networks are always built up in layers. And so, you know, one of the things I'm constantly talking about is this concept of the Internet of Me or IO-Me. We talk about Internet of Things, we talk about LANs and WANs and all these different networks. But one of the things we forget about is what we're trying to create is this Internet of My experience. And that means that we're going to end up having these PANs, so the devices are going to play a very important part of these personal area networks that interface with all these connected devices. And so that really requires this capability to be able to share spectrum, not only across networks, but eventually as we start trying to create mini networks of my phone connecting to your phone or my devices connecting to you as you come in and out of venues. So that's a very important part of, to me, of the future of shared spectrum. I'm happy to be here to be discussing, you know, how we can get there. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Derek. All right, Josh, I think it is your turn next. Take it away for opening statements.
So Josh Weaver, I'm a senior systems engineer with the Navy, and I've been supporting OUSD R&E for a number of years, and pretty much since the birth of the National Spectrum Consortium. So I've been working with a lot of you guys for a long time, and funny enough, it's going to sound a little bit like Mark and I worked beforehand and coordinated our discussion points here, but we didn't. We just happened to be in related fields here. So just being the government guy here, I wanted to make it very clear that I'm not here discussing you know, the stance of DoD policy, but I'll be representing the work that we've done with DoD, but not the policy side. We have a lot of folks that do policy for their day jobs, and I'm not them. Our job in R&E as the Chief Technology Office is to develop and incubate those next generation you know, emerging technologies. And if we do our job right, we're going to keep the policy folks really busy as they try to catch up and take advantage of all the spectrum sharing technologies that we're creating. So sharing spectrum, you know, from a DoD standpoint, has a lot of you know, dual use potentials. You hear DoD say dual use a lot. So we can build up the economic security by enabling all the additional commercial exploitation of spectrum resources, and also enhance national security by equipping our critical systems with the abilities to adapt and overcome challenges in the spectrum resource usage. So as Mark mentioned before, and others, you know, the CBRS has proven that spectrum sharing is not only possible but worth expanding on and improving upon to unlock even more opportunities in the spectrum and to increase performance of those sharing models. So what the DoD has done, we have, through the Spectrum Access Research and Development Program, we took a collaborative approach to advancing some of these technologies by engaging with the NSC membership here and you know, collectively discussing the art of the possible and where practical, strategic investments should be made to make the greatest impacts in the L-band specifically, because that was those efforts were funded by the AWS-3 auction. So during that, we developed some technologies to increase the accuracy and accessibility in spectrum situational awareness, you know, the sensing piece, to better understand the electromagnetic environment, which included the development of cost-effective sensors and open architectures to take advantage of things like distributed network of heterogeneous sensor networks. Developed high-resolution sensors that can can look at very large instantaneous bandwidths, and developing methods to increase the intelligence from RF sensor data, such as signal classifications, generation of power frequency heat maps, correlating sense data with planned anticipated spectrum usage for action, after action analysis and reporting. Another technology we did was the rapidly responding sense and avoid dynamic spectrum access technologies to avoid interfering with incumbent spectrum users by continually scanning the band for unused channels and judiciously emitting an unused spectrum dynamically. We also developed interference mitigation technologies such as beamforming, filtering, signal excision, and signal processing to increase the frequency and spatial diversity to enable same frequency full duplex communications. And we expanded communication capabilities by accessing new and additional bands, including ultraviolet, infrared, and even free space optics. So some challenges to cover down on in the future, I think, exploring some of the technologies that are going to allow us to share preemptive spectrum usage data that takes into account the sensitivities on both sides of the fence. So, for example, when you talk sharing between DoD and commercial entities, the commercial side typically wants some reasonably predictable level of quality of experience that they can sell to their users, whereas the DoD is pretty sensitive to their operational securities and their tactics, techniques, and procedures. So coming up with new and novel ways to exchange data while protecting those interests. Some of the things that I've been considering are looking at some of the work that has been done with the Department of Transportation and their 5G vehicle to everything communications side link, where they were taking a look at protecting privacy of their users, but by not being able to track, which vehicle belongs to whom and where they're going and where they've been. And then other technologies like fully homomorphic encryption, which allows you to do math and make decisions on data that's encrypted without decrypting it, as if you were working on plain text data, which currently today is computationally very expensive, but there are some hardware efforts being done by some folks in the government that aim to reduce that computational load by several orders of magnitude. So exciting technologies on the future, I think, to apply to this problem, in addition to some of the other things that we're going to be talking about today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Josh. And finally, we have Sachin Shetty. Please go ahead, Sachin, for opening remarks.
Absolutely. I think I have slides. All right. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide. So I'm just going to share an academic perspective on everything spectrum sharing and sensing. So some of the concepts dovetails the previous panelist comments as well. So we're going to talk about two topics here, learning-based dynamic spectrum access, and another point that Joshua mentioned about maintaining privacy while doing so. So again, we all know the purpose of doing this is trying to figure out a spectrum allocation function so that we understand what amount of power that we would like our secondary user or different priority levels of users to gain access. And in this diagram over here, you'll notice a scenario where you have mobile primary users and secondary users, and in almost real time, you would like to determine, you can imagine the dynamics associated with the licensed users hopping between environments. The real-time situational awareness keeps on changing. The role of high priorities keep on changing. And so while we determine the received signal strength in the field, how do you also juxtapose that with different priorities of information that will also be exchanged? And so as the first strategy is coming up with a machine learning based mechanism to first gather all the information that you can regarding to the power, the location, as a matter of fact, even the traffic profiles, so that you can figure out what type of spectrum allocation function that you want to come up with. And then keeping in mind that you'll also have to ensure that you may not be able to allocate the power that you decide at all times, and that might vary as well. And so what would be the risk, right? So being able to predict that, being able to track that so that you're well informed in terms of what are the risks associated with allocating the spectrum, And in some cases, you may not be able to provide that. And so getting ahead of that and knowing in which areas and in which type of scenarios you could. And that's why a learning-based mechanism is going to be significantly helpful. Having said that, let's go to the next slide. Again, a lot of the learning-based algorithms, there are many ways to do that. There are deep learning mechanisms to do that. We definitely need to get away from the feature-based type of machine learning, which becomes pretty harder to track because creating features and creating label data is extremely challenging. And there are several machine learning algorithms that are out there that can help us overcome feature-based learning, so which is always a good news. But having said that, there's a need for a lot of data that is needed, whether it's this using the strength, whether it's the location and the power required. And so being able to process, analyze the data, and ensuring that you're keeping up with the various noise environments that will keep on changing. A lot of the machine learning environments do tend to assume a certain noise environment, and when that keeps on changing, how do you adapt to that? Because a lot of the training environments tend to be one time only, and so you can train a training model on a one-time assumption of the environment. But when the dynamics of the environment keeps on updating, how do you ensure that you're up to date? So here's a concept of using reinforcement learning where you can constantly keep track of the noise floor and updating your perspective of the environment, and so that you're not locked in within a certain expectation of the noise environment. So dynamically updating a machine learning model to keep tracking the noise floor and interference environments is extremely critical, because if you don't, then you are locked into a specific model, and the spectrum allocation function becomes a function of the model that you already had, and you're not keeping up with the dynamics of the environment. Next slide. So in order to have this learning-based mechanism to be successful, you need to depend on sensors. And if you're going to depend on sensors, and you're going to depend on these sensors either cooperating, or in some cases, you cannot expect a full cooperation. So how do you ensure that given different environments, what type of level of cooperation can be expected? And again, making sure that you can extract the key RSSI indicators from the various sensors and be able to determine which sensors you're going to depend on your information. And there's a very key security and privacy concern with this approach that I want to touch upon in the next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so now you can see the situation, right? So you have the ability to get real-time trusted information from various sensors. But having said that, how do you make sure that the privacy of that information is not compromised? And privacy, obviously focuses on primarily the location privacy, right? So, and again, if you have adversaries who are aware of sensors that are deployed out there, how can we be resilient to those? So there are various approaches out there. Joshua mentioned a couple of them. So there are fingerprinting approaches, whether it's device fingerprinting or RF fingerprinting. And there are other approaches regarding with privacy. So you can either use cryptographic approaches. So we know some of the challenges with homomorphic. There's another approach with secure multi-party computations, or rather in this case, secure two-party computations. So that has, again, some of the work that my group is doing on secure two-party computation, which does have legs in terms of scalability. Another approach is, data obfuscation. So what you can do to obfuscate your data, and so that also has legs in terms of perturbing your traces, so that again, a non-cryptographic approach to maintain privacy. Again, you got to try multiple ways. So you got your data obfuscation way, you got your multiple cryptographic ways, and so my group is looking at some of these efforts, again, focused on trying to figure out not only to ensure the privacy, but also the computation that comes with it. So we don't want to be limited by the privacy techniques. So at least in my group, we are working on secure two-party computations, and that's an approach that we feel would be much scalable in the future. So those are my opening remarks, and look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I think you've given us some really good building blocks to start off this conversation. So I know a lot of us are experts who are tuning in and who are on this panel. I am not a technologist, I'm not an attorney, nor am I an engineer. So we're gonna start very top level. Why is spectrum sharing a necessity? Why is this something that your companies and your organizations are even working on? Anyone can take a stab at that.
Okay, well, I'll start then. You know, as working for the DoD, who is oftentimes is the target of opportunity for spectrum resources to sell off for commercial use, we find that spectrum sharing, I mean, that's obviously an untenable model, right? Eventually we're going to run out of spectrum to take, you know, without impacting national security. So I think sharing is a necessary approach, especially in these, when we're talking congested environments. The spectrum is one of those things that, you know, it's increasingly demanded, and we're becoming increasingly congested, but it's also an infinitely renewable resource. So as soon as you're done using it, you can get off the channel, someone else can use it, and away you go. So I think that's one of the reasons it's imperative to really figure this spectrum sharing out, is that we can tighten up our efficiencies and really get a lot more use for both national security and for commercial purposes out of the spectrum resources that we have. And then some of those foundational technologies that help us avoid unintended interference, let's call it, in the congested bands are also applicable when we start getting into contested bands and somebody trying to deny our use of spectrum resources. So for a whole multitude of reasons, I think spectrum sharing is absolutely impeccable to do and to get right. Over.
Excellent. Does anyone else want to jump in with any thoughts on why spectrum sharing is a very worthy endeavor?
You know, I'll just jump in on, you know, and give you some examples. You know, there's a lot of, you know, at the end of the day, our job is to help people get networks up that allow them to do their digital transformation, whether it's, you know, transportation or sports centers or military locations. One of the things that we always are focusing on is how do we help them through that digital transformation? And we only had so much technology available to us. So it's like, okay, well, we've got unlicensed Wi-Fi. Okay, I've got, you know, now CBRS, I can do some unlicensed cellular, or I've got to partner with somebody who has a license, or try to see if I can get on one of these shared licensed spectrums. So what we're constantly doing is you're trying to balance and you're trying to create these coexisting networks, so you can meet all these business needs instead of focusing in what we're trying to do in 5G is, hey, let's stop thinking about just the networks. Let's start thinking about the use cases that we want to do and the experiences we want to have, and then let's bring the technology to fit that. And then to really get there, in 6G, what I like to talk about is 5G is about enterprise networking or use case networking, and 6G is really about autonomous networking. And so to be able to have an autonomous network where you have co-integrated networks working together instead of working against each other, and interference is thought about as part of that, you really need to start sharing the spectrum. You got to sense it, you got to understand it, so that you can end up meeting all the needs that we have with the digital transformation. And it's happening everywhere, and it's going to continue to happen. And you only have so much wireless spectrum available to you. So we need to figure out how to be able to take that unused spectrum and use it. And that's why slicing and spectrum sharing are essential.
Awesome. Well, to go back to what you both said about unused spectrum and really needing to maximize those bands when and where you can find them. I think an example that the federal government and on some level private industry is looking at now is the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band. Could someone maybe talk about the importance of this band, why this is something that government industry is eyeing right now, and maybe what it could mean for commercial license use in the future? Anyone want to take a stab?
Repeat your question again. I mean, why is 3.1? Why is that band important?
Yeah, exactly. Why is 3.1 to 3.45 on everyone's radar right now, and what do we think this is going to mean for the future of spectrum sharing?
Well, one of the biggest problems with spectrum sharing is you have to leave and turn off when the legacy user comes. But I think the 3.1 and 3.4, they're lightly used. I think that they're going to be used for sharing a very high fraction of the time. The one of the few bands where I think you get this very high reuse. Where these other bands, you're gonna, you might get use of it 80% of the time or 30%, but you're gonna get, commercial users are gonna get very high use of this band. It'll be very valuable because the legacy uses light.
Gotcha. And so if I'm not mistaken, this is one of those bands that government and private coordination is going to be very important for, and that's going to be why it wasn't seen as a perfectly low-hanging fruit in the past. Could someone maybe talk about what this coordination between government and industry is going to look like in 2021 and beyond, especially given some of the hurdles that government and industry have already crossed in terms of trying to share spectrum and work out those risk assessments that the military has to make versus the opportunities that shared spectrum can present for private industry. Anyone want to take a shot at that?
I will. In the DFS band, they didn't really prototype and do a lot of field testing, and they made mistakes. But in 3.14, the government's spending a lot of money prototyping. And hopefully, by the time they finish all these projects they're working on, they'll have a very reliable answer that everyone believes in, and they'll avoid making a mistake and have to back up. So I think this is, the first time there's been a lot of prototyping done up front by the government.
Yeah. And I think another thing that we're doing this time around is the NSC has started some working groups with the government and with the industry and academia to discuss things like spectrum sharing and help the policymakers be informed on where the technology can take us and what we should we should be thinking about in moving forward with spectrum sharing. With both with the regulatory groups and the 5G working group, and then the recently announced paths group that we talked about at the beginning of this call. So I think that collaborative discussion, I think, is really good for. If we're going to be sharing anyway, we might as well hash out our agreements and disagreements and figure out what everybody needs on both sides to be amenable for the spectrum sharing arrangement.
It's really important to do the upfront work in detail, the testing and the talking, and not just blunder and make mistakes. There's too much money at stake. It doesn't cost that much to prototype and test and communicate compared to blunders.
Yeah, I think the collaborative approach that the government's been taking the last few years is very important. In the past, it was the same thing with on the private sector where all the carriers or all the MNOs and all the MSOs, and even in the industry, we're not working together. And then we recognized, hey, we need to start working together. And now, with the DoD now and the government getting involved, we're starting to see this collaboration between universities and standards groups and the government and industry really being able to solve some of these problems. Because what you'll find is each of us have a different solutions that we've come up with in our different areas, with how we're taking advantage of that spectrum. The MNOs, with only 10 megahertz had to really figure out how to make that 10 megahertz stretch as far as they could when they, spending billions of dollars on it. So they've built some great techniques for doing so. And then you have the unlicensed group who ended up having a lot of spectrum, but they had a lot of different players coming in and interfering. So we had DFS and some of those other things and some other shared means and segmentation that we've done. And now what we're realizing is segmentation is not enough. This idea of segmenting networks and piecing off different pieces for everybody isn't going to meet our future needs. We're really going to have to figure out how to make it so that we look at all spectrum as one big, freeway that we can take advantage of.
So what I think I'm hearing from all of you is the importance of setting those expectations at the outset as a band is being mapped out for sharing. And I think we have seen maybe some bands that have backslid, at least in the public conversation, after they've been rolled out and even potentially auctioned off for new uses. So I'm talking about the C band. This is one that remains in the conversation as the FAA, the FCC, the aviation industry, the mobile carriers all kind of talk about how these wireless airways can coexist with certain flight instruments. Using this as sort of like an example, what would you say is the best way to get all stakeholders in a band on the same page about acceptable interference parameters? And do any of you think there's maybe a set of rules of the road that future band reorganizers could use to kind of make sure that these things go more smoothly?
But I think, as Mark mentioned earlier, I think prototyping up front is a very powerful way to go about it. So you have to, open up the lines of conversation for all the stakeholders, build, fund some initial seed work to build some test beds and just test to see if your technologies are going to answer the mail for the sharing paradigm that they're looking to explore with whatever auction you're talking about, and then when you do those experimentations, especially if you can sustain a more long-term one, you can build that trust in the technology. And I think that's the big issue right now when you start talking DSA, is the level of trust. Who's managing the algorithms, and how are you ensuring that you're not trying to game me, or that when a critical need for spectrum usage, I need to hit a button and stop a missile flyover, for example. That message absolutely has to get through, and I don't care who's on that spectrum, but they need to get off, and I need to be assured of that. So having, building that level of trust, I think, is only going to come through experimentation, modeling, simulation, and then no kidding, experimentation. Over.
Your question makes the assumption that if I got them to accept more interference, I'd get more spectrum. And I'm not quite sure. NTI published INR levels that they define harmful interference in a conservative way. I've never seen a study that if those change by 3 dB would get that much more spectrum. There's adjacent channel issues like this whole altimeter stuff with the FAA, where the adjacent channel and equipment screw ups and receiver standards is maybe more the areas. Do we protect crappy equipment versus accept co-channel interference? That, to me, is the bigger question, is receiver standards on adjacent channel rejection. Because that seems to be a weird edge case that's driving some people bananas now, and that's not that too hard to fix with some money. Fix those old units.
That's a great point, Mark. And I think we're hearing a lot about receiver standards, especially out of the FCC right now. I know Commissioner Nathan Symington has been talking about looking at not only the way we're using spectrum now, but the way that certain devices operate on that spectrum and adjacent bands. I'm sorry, go ahead, Derek. What were you going to say?
No, I was going to say that's one of the challenges. Is in the past we're always talking about the network instead of what's going over the network. And if we start changing the conversation of, okay, what's going over that network, and we start setting priorities and allow some form of sentient, what I like to call sentient object programming, where those sentient programs that we're creating that are going across those wires are part of the network. They're not just something that's going over the network and driving on the network, but they're actually part of it. And it goes into what Sachin was sharing with his sensors and having this collaborative distributed sensors. But in addition to that, you also have to have the network as part of it. So there's a multifaceted design here. But in the end, what we really need to do is we need to create this augmented analytics capability in the network that allows us to understand what's going through that network so we can prioritize it. And if we just keep going and saying, well, the network's going to do it, and not involve and collaborate also with the devices and the services that are going across that network, then it's a no-win game. We've got to think beyond just the network as well. And it involves all of that stuff, the ESC, the collaboration of the devices, the collaboration of those applications.
And I think if I might add, because I think this is dovetails what Josh was also talking about, why do we need experimentation? So it's not just experimentation of the prototype, but also the applications that run on it. So if you've seen some of the NSC and other consortium, they have been mindful of not just investing in the infrastructure, but at the same time, and that's always a good sign, like you don't wait for the infrastructure to be built out and then design the applications around it, and you do it all at the same time. And there is some value in that, because you then get insights into because we have this holy grail of the latency and throughput, and we have to condition that on what type of applications can realize it, because we always think that a particular network can provide that low latency for any type of application service. So this experimentation capabilities allow us to provide a sobering message to what type of data can be supported. And that's another aspect of this, the aspect of security. And I feel like while we're designing this, we can't do that in production environment, but in a prototyping, we can look at various attack vectors that we potentially would not have been able to look in a production environment. So being able to catch that, or at least identify those attack surfaces earlier on, document it, and actually make that part of, let's say, an MBSE approach where somebody could know about that earlier on, and so they can track it, and then they can hold to fire to whoever is going to be providing their production level system that, hey, this is what we found in experimentation. So make sure that this attack surface is mitigated prior to deployment.
Great. Well, I want to go back to something that Mark said in his opening statement. You were talking about how you kind of had your mind changed from first believing that the database approach to spectrum sharing was the best way to go, and now you've kind of come around to preferring a sensing capability. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about how these two approaches to spectrum sharing are different, and what it was that changed your mind to start preferring a sensing approach?
Oh, I prefer it because it gets rid of propagation loss uncertainty, and you don't need to be connected to the internet. So I had my slide showed each approach, sensing or database, worked in some cases depending on the legacy or the entrance parameters. So I don't necessarily like one more than the other, but I don't want to be boxed in and just pick one and think that's the only one that's going to work, because you're going to just leave a lot of spectrum on the table and unhappy users.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, if I was to chime in, in the past, we used to always talk about 5 nines, fault tolerance, and everything has to be fault tolerant. I think that the conversation's changing, and we're recognizing that fault tolerance is important, but more important than fault tolerance is fault awareness and being able to adapt to faults appropriately given the given system. And that ends up getting into all the stuff that we're doing with edge and distributed systems and mesh security, and a lot of this stuff is we're realizing that a distributed system with fault built across the system instead of built only inside that system is a better fault system than something where you're just trying to build a system that's closed and it's only can deal with the faults that it's aware of. And so I think that that's one of the nice things that's changing is us recognizing that there's software systems that we can bring into place in our network systems, as well as all these different things we've learned across the industry to be able to build a more responsive and tiered service model for our networks.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an important thing to capture, especially as the software-defined networking and those kinds of technologies start to really propagate. When you talk about having this 5 nines, but that's availability of the system as a whole, right? And then it cuts off and it's a full stop. Everything's down. Whereas, what you were describing with you distribute the load of some of the services, and you can have a graceful navigation, if you will. So it's not really, I don't know how to define that in nines, where you lose, partial services, but you're not losing the entire network. You're not losing all of your critical communications, or you've got it compartmentalized in a way that you can take an outage in one small system, and it's not going to, wipe out the power in the entire Eastern Corridor, or whatever the case may be. Over.
So I also wanted to go back to something that both Josh and Sachin mentioned in their opening statements. The conundrum of protecting spectrum users' privacy while also promoting open access of that spectrum. Could you get into a little bit more of how your organizations are looking to strike that balance?
Yeah, I can talk from an academic research perspective. I think Joshua would have more insight into operational side. So as I mentioned, I think we all know, right? So we do want to maintain the privacy for multiple reasons, not only maintaining privacy of the location of the sensors, but also making sure that other entities are not aware of the spectrum sensing reports. So there are two approaches. One is the cryptographic key-based approaches, where you encrypt everything. That's easier said than done. You can encrypt the information, but then performing operations on that encrypted data, depending on the type of encryption used, can be more computationally expensive. So that's the trade-off. So but there are various ways to do those. I mentioned about my research team working on this effort on two-party computation that has some. It's still a cryptographic-based approach, but it's scalable. The non-cryptographic based approaches, obfuscate the data, right? So you try to obfuscate the data that is being shared, and then use that as a mechanism to maintain the privacy. Now, is it possible for colluding sensors and colluding users to get together and figure. I'm sure, and that's why I mentioned about that analyzing the attack surface, right? Figure out where it's possible for a group of colluding secondary users to figure out what the primary users' parameters are, and so how likely that is in given environment, what opportunities exist in the environment. Operationally, is that feasible? Mathematically, I can show it is, but then operationally, how realistic is it, right? What is the risk, right? So coming up with the risk, that there's risk with everything, but can you quantify the risk? What is the risk of revealing your sensing information by colluding group of users on a risk of level of 0 to 10? So if we can develop approaches, inform the risk associated with it, then we at least knowledgeable about what is the risk of using spectrum sensing approach to privacy. Over.
Yes, I won't speak on future policy actions, but I will state what DoD policy is today and what it allows us, and kind of what Sachin was mentioning, right? Is CBRS in a sense is a way of obscurating data, right? It relies on a sensor network on the coastlines to sense Navy radars, which are pretty high power, so it senses them from a pretty far distance away, and then through a SAS it tells the emissions in that band to turn down or turn off for hundreds of radio miles. So that's one of the trade-offs you get with the obscuration methods, is you lose a good amount of efficiency in your spectrum sharing abilities, because you're introducing a lot of uncertainty into the decision engine, and that's what the Navy was okay with at the time when CBRS was being proposed, right? I'm not going to tell you where my ships are, that's classified, but you can sense for energy in this particular band and make your own decisions from there. And as long as we're not using it, if you can't sense it, we're not there, we're not using it, you can use it, that's fine. So I think to move to a more efficient model and that tightens up those radiuses and timescales, that's where we need to develop those next generation technologies that can protect those informations, and then test them and experiment with them, and then prove, build that level of trust in those technologies that we can, protect the interests of both parties and gain those extra efficiencies.
Excellent, that makes a lot of sense. So we just have a few more minutes for my Q&A portion. So I wanted to throw a couple of policy questions at all of you, and please just let me know if this is something you can speak to. If not, I understand this is kind of a late addition to our Q&A. But the Senate Commerce Committee this afternoon advanced the nomination for Alan Davidson to lead the National Telecommunications and Information Administration under the Commerce Department. And as you all know, this organization, or rather this agency, has a lot of sway over the way that government and industry works together and shares spectrum. If confirmed, what do you think Mr. Davidson's top priority should be, and what do you think will be some of his biggest challenges? Does anyone want to give that one a shot?
Well, if I was him, I would go band by band and say I'd hypothesize different spectrum sharing approaches were done, and and he's got classified information. He knows what, or could find out. He probably doesn't really know, but DoD could tell him, and they could do the calculation of what bands offer what value in terms of opportunity for commercial spectrum sharing. That's the first thing I would do. I mean, maybe they're doing that in some of these bands. At a high level, the NTI reports just say we're concerned there's not much spectrum. They don't really answer the question in the NTI reports that I've the recent one in the 3.5 this C-band didn't quantify things. So that's what I would do, is I would look at sensing, database, combinations, and I would quantify the value of sharing. What could I get out of it versus relocation costs?
And I would counter that slightly in that I think the FCC would do that from a commercial standpoint. What makes sense? How can we free up more spectrum for commercial use? Whereas the NTIA would look more to protect the resources that the federal government still has left. I think what he would focus on, if sharing was being encouraged by his leadership, looking for ways that the federal government could relinquish or offer increased access to spectrum that is currently owned by federal users in a way that protects its missions. So some of the things you've seen in the news, right? The NOAA satellites, the flight altimeters, those kinds of systems that have a need and provide services to the public from a technical standpoint, and need some level of protection. But at the same time, can we? Is there a better way to operate those systems or protect those systems in a way that increases opportunities to access those spectrum bands?
I would just weigh in and say much the same. I think, we've started down a road of good collaboration. I think we should focus on that, and extending that collaboration is important. I just got off a call with the FCC CISRIC committees that I sit on. I think that there's an opportunity for us to start seeing more of that kind of approach, where we do, as Mark said, these prototyping, but we do this together with all the different players. And I think that there's an opportunity for that. Everybody's ready for it. I think this, across the board, that's why we're here talking, is because we're all from different parts, but we're all trying to solve the same problem together. And I think having the FCC and the NTIA work closer, I think, is also important.
Awesome. Well, I think that brings us to the audience Q&A portion. We want to open things up for any listeners to go ahead and ask our panelists some questions. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but maybe one of our organizers can point me in the right direction. Okay, so we have one coming in already. Mark mentioned the importance of propagation models as a basis for sharing. And this listener wants to know how sharing models will deal with issues such as ducting. I am, again, not an engineer, so I'm not sure what we're referring to with ducting, but maybe you can explain that.
Well, if you had a perfect model, you could account for it, but there are no perfect models for ducting that are affordable. So ducting can make a 20, 30, 40 dB error in what you're doing 10 or 20% of the time. So if ducting is impacting your links, you need to use sensing to see if you're within propagation range or not of the legacy unit. Either that, or you have to invent some way to have Uber models that can predict it, but they don't exist now. It'd be great if they did.
This is mostly from my knowledge, Mark, but can you give us a layman's definition of ducting?
Oh, if there's a temperature inversion or humidity inversion in the air, instead of the wave going up into space, it gets bent by the atmosphere and comes back down. So you think you're 150 dB loss from someone over the horizon, but you made a 40 dB error. You're seeing the refracted wave trapped in the air coming back down. If you're in a humid environment, this can happen 30, 40% of the time.
Gotcha, thank you for that. All right, while we wait for some more audience questions to roll in, I do have a couple more questions up my sleeve. I wanted to know if you all have any thoughts on the importance of a national spectrum strategy and what is lost the longer we go without one. I think this is something that the Biden administration has been working on in the last year. I think we're expecting to see the release of a spectrum strategy coming out in 2022. But I'm just curious, what have we lost in a year without a spectrum strategy, and what do you hope to see in terms of the effects of having a spectrum strategy, hopefully on the table next year?
Well, I think the spectrum strategy is missing the idea of sharing. I mean, if you're sharing, you're not going to get the channel. So if you paid an auction for a channel and lost it, you're out of luck. Maybe we should have a pooling approach where you're in a band, and if you have to leave, you just move over and your buddies make room for you. I mean, the strategy is if you have to share, that person goes to nothing and other people in the band keep going. It's not a sharing approach. They should assume there's going to be sharing and some loss to the legacy use, and how to make sure the commercial guy gets his 100 megahertz without turning everybody else off. Strategy lacks a sharing approach. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, and that goes back to my earlier comments on the reasonably predictable quality of experience that can be sold to their customers, right? If the government is the incumbent, and the commercial guy can't necessarily guarantee that they're going to, when the government's not going to be on the channel, we can offer this. It could be very ad hoc. So it's, I mean, that's a good conversation to have and to keep that dialogue going, because it's a non-trivial problem.
Another problem is the legacy guy, what if he doubles his use? What if they fly 20 AWACS planes instead of 10 or whatever the numbers are? Well, there was an auction, the people are going to scream. So that we have to have a strategy to have the legacy users who are giving up rights to reclaim them. So maybe we go to full, maybe we should be unlicensing more spectrum and not auctioning it, because the auction guys are going to hate that when the legacy use changes. So we don't have a good policy framework for sharing. Either we pen the legacy guy in, and then there's the loser when you have to leave, he gets nothing.
We'll just make them both co-primary, Mark.
All right, we've got another audience question, and this might take us home. So this listener wants to know, after the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band is cleared or shared or whatever is decided to be feasible for that band, what is the next band that should be the target for sharing? Specifically, do you have any thoughts about the 7 gigahertz band for sharing? I see some possible nods, maybe.
I would go back to the E&G band. I mean, there's a plan in place, but it's going really slow, and that's a great band. There's a lot of spectrum there. I would come back to what could be better done in the the 2025, 2010 band. DoD got some access, but I mean, Derek would love to get that band. And if you took a spectrum analyzer outside, it's empty. It's empty all the time. But that's
Any
not.
other thoughts?
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I have a hard time answering that just because I think every megahertz is worth its weight in gold. So the more we can get, the better. I think the reality is we just got to get better at using it, as well. So, you don't want to have something eat up the whole band or the whole frequency that you're using that only needs this much. So slicing is going to be an important part of the future solutions as well. So I think we need to be thinking, as we're thinking about frequency availability, we also need to think about frequency and how we can chop it up to be able to be used for different use cases.
Great. Any other closing thoughts on future targets for spectrum sharing?
I'll take some liberties with the word sharing and go on with relocation, where if we start exploring millimeter band and moving some of the systems that don't necessarily need the beachfront frequencies of the long propagation distances and relatively high throughputs, but move things into, for home Wi-Fi, for example, that millimeter wave might offer some advantages. It doesn't propagate very far. You're not going to interfere with your neighbors necessarily if you tune your network correctly. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to relocate things that are in these high value bands out of them and then open those up for other use cases that might be more appropriate for those frequencies.
Great. Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and close out our Q&A and turn things over to David Love for some closing remarks. Take it away, David.
All right, thank you. So this concludes our tech talk on the state and future of spectrum sharing. On behalf of the entire NSC and the executive committee, I'd like to thank the panelists and the moderator today. It's been a great discussion. Also, I wanted to thank all the audience members for tuning in and for your questions. If anyone has any questions about the NSC, feel free to reach out to me or to any of the other executive committee members. We also have a lot of information on our website, nationalspectrumconsortium.org. Be on the lookout for the 2022 Tech Talk topics that are going to be coming out. We hope to have those roughly monthly continuing on. So thank you very much. Have a great day.